Okay, Lamed Vav Amud Beis on the bottom of the page. Let's learn a little bit about thick matzah. Okay, 36b3. A tanurbanan eofen pas ava be Pesach. You're not allowed to bake a thick loaf on Pesach. Divrei Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says you can't bake a thick loaf on Pesach. Ubeis Hillel Matir. Beis Hillel says it is not a problem to bake a thick loaf. Okay, we're Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. V'chama pas ava. How thick is a thick loaf? Amar Rav Huna tefach. It is a tefach large. Shekematzinu b'lechem apanim tefach. Regarding the lechem apanim, they made bread a tefach thick. Okay, and lechem apanim, the bread that was used in Beis Hamikdash, also cannot be chametz, and yet they made it a tefach thick. So what's the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? Beis Shammai seems to be concerned that when it's thick, it takes longer to bake, right? Because there's just more there, and therefore there's a concern that while it's in the oven, some of the bread is going to become leaven and it's going to become chametz. But if it's very thin, you don't have that issue. Okay, Beis Shammai therefore says it can't be thick, and Beis Hillel says no problem. You're allowed to have it thick, but as not thicker than a tefach, which is still pretty thick. We're talking about the tefach's not small, right? Basically, you'd be saying matzah could be this big, okay? The Gemara asked the question, reason. If they said, what proof are you bringing from lechem apanim? If they said this by his reason, meaning again, we saw this terminology yesterday. This reason are like people who are very diligent. A reference to Kohanim. You hear that? The Kohanim are the people who are very diligent. They're going to be very careful to make sure nothing happens. Yomi b'sheinon's reason, they're going to say the same thing by people who are not diligent. If they're going to say this by lechem apanim, which was well-worked loaf. In other words, the Gemara talks about elsewhere that they used to pound the bread like hundreds of times before making it into lechem apanim. Yom Rapashin Amula, they're going to say so by Pesach matzah, which is, they beat it, but not to such a degree. And Amr Beis Veshim, they're going to say this with dry wood. In the Beis Hamikdash, they had stored wood. They have a huge storehouse of wood, and therefore the wood was very, very dry. Yom Beis Lachem, they're going to say the same thing with Pesach matzah, which is not always they're not always using dry wood. They use whatever wood they have. Sometimes it's dry, sometimes it's moist. Moist wood, obviously, is not as strong, and therefore there's more of a concern of chametz. If they're going to say this by a hot oven, in the Beis Hamikdash, the ovens were firing hot. It's like you go to one of these huge bakeries, they have these massive, huge, fiery ovens because the fact that they have so much bread. They have all these, in the Beis Hamikdash, there's a ton of bread being baked. Mincha after offering, mincha offering after mincha offering. Yom Tanar Tzon, you're going to say the same thing in an oven which is, potentially relatively cool. Imram Tanar Shal Matechas, it said this in regards to a metal oven. The oven in the Beis Hamikdash was made of metal, which gets very hot. Yom Tanar Shal Cheres is going to say this by an earthenware oven. Most people's personal ovens back in the day were earthenware. Bottom line is, the Gemara says, how could you tell me that Beis Hillel is allowing it to be up to tefach because lechem apanim and matzah are in two different worlds. One has all these factors which ensure that it gets hot, really quickly, and it's very beaten. Okay, all these things which prevent it from becoming chametz, and you can't say all those things by matzah. So Amar Yirmiyah bar Abba she'iltis is Rebbe b'yichud. Rav Yirmiyah says I asked my teacher privately. Okay, Umanu, who is his teacher? Rav. Okay, why he asked him privately is not clear from the Mepharshim. I didn't find any good explanations, but the bottom line is he asked his teacher, and his teacher was Rav. Ikad Amri, there's a different version that says Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav. Rav Yirmiyah Abba said in the name of his teacher that Rav said she'iltis is Rebbe b'yichud, that he said that Rav said he asked his teacher Umanu, who is Rav's teacher, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, okay, known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So my pasava, okay, based on these questions, we're reconsidering what does it mean by thick loaf. Pas meruba. Rather, what they were referring to is many loaves, more than are needed for Yom Tiv. We're no longer talking about, as we're about to see, a specific matzah halacha, and really Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are not arguing about whether or not you're allowed to have a thick piece of matzah. Actually, according to both of them, you are allowed to have a thick piece of matzah. It's only us Ashkenazim and many Sfardim who are strict. But strictly speaking, those lafa things, they're thicker than a lafa. Like those thick ones are really, strictly speaking, okay. It's not the minhag, of Ashkenazim to have them, but strictly speaking, they're okay. People sometimes who have like significant stomach issues where matzah is really, really going to be harmful for them. They'll oftentimes be encouraged to eat those types of thicker matzahs because it's less I don't know, that doesn't hurt the stomach to the same degree, and because even Beis Shammai would not disagree. In other words, we're rejecting that approach. They're not actually arguing about how thick the matzah could be. Rather, what are they arguing about? About how many loaves. If you're allowed to make more loaves than are needed for Yom Tiv. Okay, what they're arguing about is Beis Hillel saying, Beis Shammai says you cannot use more loaves than are needed for your meals. If you're baking on Yom Tiv, right? You're allowed to bake on Yom Tiv. So on Sukkot, if you want more challah, no problem. If your oven is on, you could go ahead and bake challah on Yom Tiv. Beis Shammai says you could only bake for what you need on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel says you could bake more. Okay, and we'll come back to why why he says you're allowed to bake more. Normally, the halacha is on Yom Tov, you're only allowed to bake what you need. You can't go ahead and do things more. Right? I can't go ahead on Yom Tov. I can cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov. I can't cook on Yom Tov for Chol Hamoed. I can't cook on Yom Tov for a weekday. So why are you allowed to bake more? We'll talk about it in a moment. So v'mai karulei pasava. Why is it called thick loaf? Mishum denefisha belisha. Because during the kneading process, it's very thick. Since you're making many loaves, it's going to be very thick. V'baisema ba'asre dahaitana. Alternatively, in the city of this Tana, the one who's teaching this Mishnah, Braisa lepas maruba pas avakarbe le. They called many loaves a thick loaf. Okay, so my taima. What's the reason that Beis Shammai says you can't bake many loaves? If you say it's because he's exerting himself unnecessarily, my ear bepesach. Why are you exclusively talking about Pesach? In other words, what's the again? The Brisa says on Pesach, Beis Shammai says you can't bake a thick loaf, which we're now understanding to mean many loaves. Beis Hillel says you can. So why does Beis Shammai say no? Is it because you're doing too much? If so, why is he talking about Pesach exclusively? I feel Yom Tov Nami be true by other Yom Tovim as well. The same discussion should apply to every Yom Tov. It's not a Pesach discussion. It's a general, halacha of Yom Tov. So when it says Inachanami, you're right. Vaitana b'Yom Tov shel Pesach kai. This Tana was specifically talking about the laws of Pesach, and therefore he taught it in the context of Pesach, but it's true to be relevant to other Yom Tovim as well. Tani Nami Hachi, we have a brisa which supports this. Beis Shammai Omrim, ein ofen pas ava b'Yom Tov, you're not allowed to bake a thick loaf on Yom Tov. Beis Hillel matirin, and Beis Hillel permits it. Okay, so what's the deal? Why does Beis Hillel allow it? Normally, you are not allowed to bake extra on Yom Tov for something which is not needed for Yom Tov, right? Now, so two things. First of all, I just want to mention. Now, that doesn't mean, let's say I'm making potato kugel, and I say, well, I only have 3 people coming, so I'm going to make a potato kugel in like one of those little tiny, find one of these little tiny pans, as opposed to making it by a 9 by whatever they are. That you're allowed to do, because if it's the normal way of baking it or cooking it, that's for sure okay. But here, Beis Hillel is saying more than that. You could go ahead and fill your oven with loaves of bread, even though you're only using 2 loaves of bread. Now, loaves of bread is not like something making a pan. Loaves of bread is loaf and loaf and loaf and loaf. Why is he permitting it to do so? So the explanation is as follows. The explanation is that if you keep in mind, their ovens back in the day were like these rounded like these domes basically. And if you insulate the whole dome, it impacts, right? Depends on your oven. If you've baked your same recipe in one person's oven, baked in another person's oven, it tastes different. Why? Because every oven's different. And also, it depends on other things in the oven at the same time. And so Beis Hillel argues that since, granted, I don't need all this bread right now, but by putting bread all over the oven, now keep in mind, they basically attach the bread to the walls of the oven, right? That's how they did it back in the day. They would attach the dough. You can still get bread like this in certain places in the Middle East, but basically attach the bread to the wall, and in doing so, it actually limits or impacts the type of heat that generates, and therefore it actually brings better flavor. Okay, so the understanding was that to bring about a certain flavor, they would fill their oven and basically put bread all over the oven walls, even though they only needed 2 pieces of bread. Right? So why are they allowed to do that? They're not, so granted, you can't go, if the goal was just because I want 20 loaves, I couldn't do it. But if the goal was because these 2 loaves are now going to taste better, then I'm allowed to do so. Even though I'm cooking more, but if in doing so it's going to help the 2 loaves that I want, I'm allowed to do it, right? Any baking which is going to enhance my baking, any cooking which is going to enhance my cooking, even if it means there's going to be a ton of extra, that is allowed. That's the reason behind Beis Hillel. Yeah.
This whole thing in Mishnah I asked you about with these weird ovens. How on earth did they kasher their ovens in those days?
They didn't. That was the whole. The earthenware ovens, they didn't kasher them. They broke them often. I believe archaeologically they find there's a lot of broken ovens that they find. But yeah, it was pottery. It was cheap.
Great. Exactly.
Yeah, and they couldn't get kasher.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Don't shape up your oven back in the day. Okay, fine. Taner Rabbanan. The Gemara goes back to a discussion of matzah. Yotzim and pas nakia. You can use white bread, meaning white flour. Uva hadra, and coarse bread, meaning with the bran still there. Uva sarikin and mitzuyarn are decorated sarikin. Okay, but Pesach. These are decorated matzahs. We'll talk about them in a moment. Alfi shamar nos and sarikin mitzuyarn b'Pesach. Even though they said that a person should not decorate their things on their matzah on Pesach. Okay, so bottom line is, even though you shouldn't do so, you'd be allowed to. Basically, people would go ahead and make designs in their matzah. They'd go ahead, right? Imagine you put them in you have, I don't know, like a bread, and there's keep in mind, it's not so thin, and they would go ahead and they'd etch something, so there'd be a little bit of things would stick out a little bit. You can imagine they basically made little shapes into their matzah. Okay? Amr Rav Yehuda, Davar Zeh Shol Baitus ben Zonim lechachamim. Baitus ben Zonim once asked the sages about this. He said, why do they say you shouldn't do so? Amr Lo, because if you start making designs, it takes time, right? The whole thing with matzah is you got to do it really quickly so that it doesn't rise, right? But if you start going ahead and making the design, oh, whoops, I missed, whatever, I'm writing trying to happy birthday on the matzah, and I missed the P or whatever it is, so I'm going to start taking time. That's a problem. So Amr Amalahem. So Baisa said, "Efshar yasen b'tfos." Okay, but I have a stamp. He said, "Listen, allow me to do it because I have a stamp. Basically, I'm not going to take time. Then they're going to just go boom and I make it. Vikbana kivan, and I could imprint it at once. Amr lo yamr kol srikin asurim. People are going to say, what? All srikin are forbidden. All the designs are forbidden. Usrike baitus mutarin, but the srikin and baisus are allowed. And others they said you can't make an exception like that because people are going to get confused. They, oh, design ones. The rabbi said, design ones are allowed. Oh, the rabbi said design ones are allowed. Oh, we should do all types of designs. Not realize one with a stamp and one is not. Right? People sometimes extrapolate the wrong conclusion from one thing to the next, and that would be, and therefore they said all types of designs are forbidden. Brisa continues. Amar Elazar bar Tzadok. Pam achas nichnasti achar abba leveis Rabbi Gamliel. Once I followed my father into the house of Rabbi Gamliel, v'viu lefanov shurikin and Pesach, and they brought him decorated these imprinted matzahs on Pesach. Amarti, I said to my father, Abla kacha amru chachamim ein osin shurikin and Pesach. Didn't they say you can't do this? Amar li beni lo shel kol adam amru. The chachamim did not say this regarding ordinary people. El shel nachdonim amru. They only said this regarding bakers. Okay, they only said that regarding bakers. The way we're learning it now is that actually the bakers are going to be a little bit more, a little slower. In other words, according to this second version, according to the second opinion, it actually says that a personal one, no problem. Why? Because a personal one, whatever. If it's not perfect, it's not perfect. But if you're in the business, you can't mess around. If there's like a little mess up, you're going to spend a lot of time, and therefore he says no. The personal ones are allowed, and therefore he says now we can eat it because the rabbis never decreed about the personal ones because people don't care as much. It's just in your house. But it was the professional ones they didn't allow because people were gonna be very careful, and therefore it might come to chametz. There is another version which says the opposite. Lo shel nachtamu amru. On the contrary, they did not say it about the bakers because the bakers actually, like Baitos wanted to argue, have those little imprints. Shel kol adam, but what they referred to was specifically those of ordinary people, and it must be in this particular case for Elazar ben Tzadok, it must be that they brought him a piece of matzah with decorations from the bakery and not a homemade one. Okay, Rav Yossi, the Brisa continues. Osin srikin kamin rikikin. A person's allowed to make thin wafer-like srikin. Vein osin srikin kamin gluskaos, but you can't make roll-like srikin. Basically, this Tana distinguishes between thin ones and thick ones. If it's thin, you can mess around a little bit because you have a little bit more time. But if it's a thick piece of dough and you start putting a design, it's not a good idea. Bottom line is the poskim say don't make designs, whether it's homemade or whether it's made in the store. Some poskim ask, wait a second, don't we make designs? Make all those holes in our matzah, right? That doesn't come naturally. They put a thing in it to make those holes. Right? They right. So they say no, that's not a design. You're not like focusing. The whole concern is I'm going to spend time there. First of all, the reason you're doing it is so to let air go through. But the point is that the reason that that's not an issue is because it's not a design. It's being done just and therefore no one's spending extra time on it. It's just a quick roll to make those holes, and therefore that is not included in this prohibition. Okay, we are now going to talk a little bit about the laws of challah. Okay, so we know that there's an obligation to remove challah from when you make enough bread, flour, dough. You have to remove challah. Nowadays we don't give it to the kohen. Nowadays we burn it. But back in the day they would give it to the kohen. And this Gemara is going to talk about some of the laws of challah, some of it as it relates to Pesach, and we're going to learn some important halachos of challah which I don't think are so well known. Tanar Rabbanan was learned in the Mishnah. Hasuf ganin, sponge bread, vadav shanim, honey bread, veskeritin and wafers, v'chalas hamasras and a pan loaf, v'meduma and a mixture of truma and chulin. Okay, petruma and challah. All these things are exempt from the obligation to separate challah. My chalas hamasres. What is this pan loaf we're referring to? I'm Rabbi Shimon Levi. Is that chalut shabali batim? It's the scalded bread of householders. Basically, it's like kind of like a bagel. They boil it and then before baking it. Okay, Amrish Lakish. So now the Gemara says, what's the reason that this Mishnah said that they're all putter from challah? Amrish Lakish halul ma'ase ilpasein. It's because they are fried. They're fried and not baked, and that's why you're going to be putter. Yochanan Amar ma'ase ilpas chayav. He says no. Yochanan says products that are fried are obligated. The reason these cases are all permitted is because they're baked in the sun. Okay, you think it's hot over here. They would bake things in the sun in the Middle East all the time, and therefore those if you're baking in the sun, that's patur from challah. Okay, meisvei. They challenge Reish Lakish, who said again. Reish Lakish says that when it's in a frying pan, it's not chayiv in challah. Rabbi Yochanan says frying pan is chayiv in challah. So they challenge Reish Lakish. The sponge bread, honey bread, and wafers asan be'ilbas chayavin. If they're made in a frying pan, they're obligated. Becham v'turin. If they're made in the sun, they're exempt. To you have to Lakish. Okay, so clearly it says if they're made in a frying pan, they're obligated. Reish Lakish just said if they're made in a frying pan, they're exempt. Right? Again, everyone agrees if it's baked, you're a chayav. The discussion of this Brisa gave a whole bunch of cases which we said are exempt. Why are they exempt? Reish Lakish says because they're fried. He says frying is out. right? Rabbi Yochanan says, no, frying is fine. It's only if they're in the sun. That's baked in the sun. That's when they're exempt. But this brisa says very clearly, if it was fried, it's still obligated. So Amar Ula, Amar Lachar B'Shem Lakish, B'Shem Lakish would say, Hachmai Skinan, Sher Tziach L'Basov Hidbik. They first heated the frying pan surface, and then they attach the dough to it, right? So if you're just frying it in a pan, and it's then the texture is one where it's like it gets fried as the oil or whatever it is gets hot. That is something which is exempt. But if you first heat up the pan and it's very hot, and then you put the bread in, the texture is going to be a little different, a little bit more bread-like, and therefore you're going to be chayiv. Okay, says the Gemara about hidbik l'sof hirtiach mai. What's the halacha if they attach the dough to the cold frying pan and afterward heat it? Hachinami d'pturin. Then Reish Lakish would hold you'd be exempt. So the Gemara asks that a tani seifa san b'cham b'turin. So why in the end of that brisa does it teach the exempt case as putting it in the sun? Lifloglis libidida. The Gemara says make a much more clean or tight brisa and distinguish between two frying pan cases. The medvar morma the brisa should have said is when is it so that you're obligated when you first heat the frying pan and then you attach the dough. But if a person first attaches the dough and then heats it, then you're going to be exempt. So why does the Gemara jump from case of frying pan to sun if there are two frying pan cases, one where you're obligated, one where you're patur? The Gemara says you're right. There are some words missing. The medvar morim, how to read the mishnah is like this. When is it so that in a frying pan you are obligated? We're at 3784. When it was first heated and then the dough is attached to it. But if it was put into a cold frying pan and then heated up, then you are going. Then it's like it was made in the sun. You're therefore going to be exempt. Tashma, another proof against Reish Lakish. Yotzim matzah hina. You fulfill the matzah obligation with a half-baked matzah, or a matzah made in a frying pan. So again, if you could fulfill your mitzvah of matzah in a frying pan, clearly that means it is bread. So we're talking about a case where the person again heated the frying pan and then afterwards attached the dough. My matzah hina. Okay, what is the half-baked matzah? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Kol sheparsa, anything could break apart. So half-baked is as long as if you pull it apart and there are strands attached, then it's too raw, it's not considered bread. But if you pull it apart, no matter how raw, and you don't have those strings and strands attached, then that's already bread. Amarava v'chein lachmi toda, the same halach applies to the loaves of the toda offering, that it has to be that much baked. Pshita, acha lachem siv, acha lachem siv. By both of them, by matzah and by the toda, it says bread, should be the same thing, of course. So where it says, no, I would have thought, tolach siv, v'krimi menu, you should offer it, echad mikol karban, 37b1, one from each as an offering, echad shlo yitzal paros. One implies that it can't be a broken loaf, acha commanda prisa damya. If it's very, very raw, even if when you separate it doesn't have strands, but it'll fall apart when you hold it. And therefore, maybe you'll think that that's not considered, that would not be okay for a Torah offering. Kamash Blan, the Gemara says no, as long as it breaks cleanly, it's sufficient. But one of the things that comes out of this Gemara, though, important, is that as long as it's baked, it doesn't matter what type. So we said if you bake a honey bread, what's honey bread? Honey bread is also honey cake, right? How many times have you taken challah when you've made cookies or cake? Zero. You're obligated to, right? It's actually a full-fledged halacha. The only difference is that the amount, I'm not going to get into the reasons right now, but the amount is actually just much higher, okay? And that's why it's not so practical. The amount that you need to have 10 cups of flour, which is a lot. But if you had a bakery, you go ask the Rosendorfs, I'm pretty sure they would do that. They do this. But if you're baking cakes, then you are obligated to separate challah. If you are making a large batter, a huge batter, again, 10 cups of flour is a lot. Okay, but bottom line is, if you're making a lot of challah, a lot of cookies, a lot of cake, any possible bakistan, any type of mazonos item, what comes out as Gemara is that it's only because it's fried and baked in the sun, that's when you have this machlokas. But if it was baked, doesn't matter if it has a ton of sugar in it, doesn't matter which is what cake is, as long as there's water in there and as long as it's dough. Again, 10 cups of flour, that's when you have to do it. Without a bracha, 16 cups of flour with a bracha, which again is not so practical, but halach l'maisa, this is something which we should keep in mind. Okay.